I didn't even bother to show up. Calvin Rhodes, respected storekeeper, church-going family man, pillar of Willow Ridge, sat at his supper table that same evening, cutting into a roast his wife had prepared, laughing at something his youngest said. While 40 miles away, a woman he had written to for 9 months was dissolving in the mud. He had never intended to meet her. The letters were a game, something to fill the slow afternoons behind the counter. He told his friend Harlan about it once, over whiskey, and they both laughed until their eyes watered. A lonely seamstress from Ohio, desperate enough to believe a stranger's words. He'd even signed his letters with a different name at first, then grown careless. What did it matter? She'd never actually come. But Lydia Rowan did come, and nobody was there. If that were you, if you had sold every single thing you owned, crossed half a country on the strength of someone's handwritten words, and stepped off a train into silence, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if stories like this move you, stories about real courage, quiet dignity, and the kind of love that shows up without any warning at all, please take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. We release new stories every week, and we would hate for you to miss a single one. Drop a comment below telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. It means more than you know. Now, let's go back to that Montana road, because what happened next changed everything. The rain had been falling since morning, the slow kind that soaks through everything before you realize how cold you've become. By the time Gideon Mercer spotted something in the road, it was nearly dark, and the trail had turned to a shallow river of brown water running downhill toward nowhere in particular. He almost didn't stop. That was the truth of it, the part he'd turn over in his mind for years afterward. He almost didn't stop. His horse, a big gray quarter horse named Chalk, had shied twice already at shadows along the tree line, and Gideon was tired in the particular way a man gets tired when he's been alone too long, and the weather has made everything worse. He had 4 miles yet to his cabin, a fire to start, and no patience left for whatever the road had decided to throw at him. Then Chalk stopped on his own and refused to move. Gideon swore under his breath. He squinted through the rain at the shape in the mud ahead. His first thought was a deer, struck by something and dragged to the edge of the trail. His second thought, arriving a half-second later like a punch he hadn't braced for, was that it was a person. He was off Chalk before he'd made the conscious decision to dismount. She was face down in the mud, which was the only reason she hadn't drowned in the 2 inches of standing water pooled across the low spot in the trail. One arm was stretched out in front of her, fingers still curved around the handle of a travel bag. The bag had burst open at the seam. Wet fabric and papers and what looked like a small tin of buttons had spilled out into the water, and she was still holding on. Even then. Even passed out cold in the mud. Still holding on. Gideon crouched beside her and pressed 2 fingers to the side of her neck. Her pulse was there, thin and fast and unsteady, like a thread pulled too tight. He rolled her gently onto her side and she made a sound. Not words. Just a sound, low in her throat. The kind a person makes when pain and cold and fear have blurred together into something that doesn't have a name anymore. "Hey!" His voice came out rougher than he intended. "Hey, can you hear me?" She didn't answer. Her lips had gone a pale grayish color, and her hair was plastered flat against her face with mud and rainwater. She was wearing a traveling dress that had been decent once, probably the nicest thing she owned, and it had been destroyed by the road. He didn't think about any of it too long. Thinking too long got people killed in weather like this. He got her up the best he could, which wasn't graceful and wasn't gentle enough, but it was fast, and fast was what mattered. She was lighter than she should have been. That registered somewhere in the back of his mind the way a wrong note registers in a familiar song. She was light the way people got light when they hadn't been eating. He draped her across Chalk's back, and the horse stood perfectly still, which was the most useful thing anyone did in that entire situation. Gideon gathered what he could of her spilled belongings from the mud, shoved them back into the ruined bag, and tied it behind the saddle. He found one wet shoe 3 feet from where she'd fallen. He didn't find the other one. He walked Chalk the 4 miles home in the rain. Didn't ride. Kept his hand on her back to make sure she didn't slide, walking beside the horse in the dark with the rain coming down steady and the mud sucking at his boots with every step. By the time he got her inside and lowered her onto the cot near the stove, her fingernails had gone blue. He'd built a fire before he did anything else, because a warm room would do more for her than anything in his limited medical knowledge. While the stove worked on the temperature, he found every blanket in the cabin, 3 of them, none of them particularly clean, and piled them over her. He filled a pot with water, got it heating on the stove. He didn't know exactly what for. It seemed like the right thing to do. She came around while he was pulling off her ruined shoes, the one she'd still had on her foot, which had a broken heel and a hole worn through the sole the size of a silver dollar. Her eyes opened. Dark brown, he noticed. The kind of dark that made it hard to tell where the pupil ended and the iris began. She stared at the ceiling of his cabin for a long moment, and he could see her trying to figure out where she was, running through the calculation that every person runs through when they wake up in an unfamiliar place. The quick, silent inventory of danger. He sat back on his heels and kept his hands where she could see them. "You're not in any danger," he said. "You were in the road. I brought you in out of the rain." She looked at him, not afraid exactly, measuring. "Where is this?" Her voice was wrecked, dry and cracked, even through the wet. "My place, about 4 miles north of the Willow Ridge cutoff." She closed her eyes. Something crossed her face that he couldn't read. "Willow Ridge," she repeated. "That where you were headed?" She was quiet for a moment. "I was headed to the Calloway property. I was told it was about—" She stopped, swallowed. "It doesn't matter where I was told it was." He didn't push. He'd learned a long time ago that the fastest way to make a person stop talking was to ask too many questions when they were still deciding how much to trust you. He got her hot water with some dried chamomile he kept for headaches, and she sat up enough to hold the tin mug herself, wrapping both hands around it even though it was nearly too hot. She drank it like she'd been in a desert. "I'm Lydia," she said when the mug was halfway empty. "Lydia Rowan, from Chillicothe, Ohio. Gideon Mercer." She nodded once, like she was filing it away. "How long were you out there?" he asked. Another pause, longer than he expected. "I'm not entirely certain," she said finally, and the way she said it, carefully, like she was choosing every word, told him that she did know, and that it was bad enough she didn't want to say it out loud. She slept for 14 hours. Gideon slept in the chair by the stove, waking every hour or so to check the fire and glance at the cot. He wasn't entirely sure why. She was breathing fine. Her color had come back before midnight. There was no practical reason to keep checking. He kept checking anyway. By the time she woke again, it was full morning and he had coffee on. She sat up slowly, looked around the cabin with clear eyes this time, and he watched her take stock of the place the way a practical person takes stock of things. The gaps between the logs where the chinking had crumbled out, the rusted hinge on the window shutter, the stack of dishes he'd been meaning to wash for several days. She didn't say anything about any of it. "Coffee?" he offered. "Please." He poured it and handed it across, and she sat on the edge of the cot with the blanket still pulled up over her shoulders, holding the coffee with both hands the same way she'd held the chamomile water the night before. Like warmth was something she'd been rationing for a long time. "I need to tell you something," she said, without looking at him. He sat down across the room on the 3-legged stool that served as his only other seat. "All right." She reached under the blanket and produced a bundle of letters, a thick one, tied with a string, the paper swollen and warped from their time in the rain, but still readable. She set them on her knee and looked at them for a moment. "I came here to marry someone," she said. "We exchanged letters for 9 months. He told me he owned a cattle operation east of Willow Ridge. Said it was called the Calloway property because he'd bought it from a man named Calloway." She paused. "He told me the house had a porch that faced the mountains, that there were flowers in the yard every spring." She looked up at Gideon. "I believed him." Gideon said nothing. He had a feeling about where this was going, and he didn't want to be right about it. "His name was—" She turned one of the letters over in her hands. "He signed them as Thomas Aldrin, but there's no Thomas Aldrin in this county. I asked at the depot. The woman at the counter, she recognized the description of the property." She smoothed the letter on her knee, one slow movement. "She said the Calloway place is owned by a man named Calvin Rhodes, and that Calvin Rhodes has been married for 11 years. Gideon felt something tighten in his chest. He knew Calvin Rhodes. Everyone in 20 miles knew Calvin Rhodes. Decent talker. Good at making people feel seen and valued. The kind of man who volunteered to organize things so his name stayed in front of people. He had never once thought to distrust him. "I waited at the depot for 3 days," Lydia said. Her voice didn't shake. That was the part that got him. Her voice was steady and flat and careful, like she'd already spent all her tears somewhere on the road. "I used my last money for a room the first night. After that, I slept in the waiting area. The station master finally asked me to leave." She looked down at the letters. "I didn't know where else to go. I started walking." "You walked from Willow Ridge," he said, "to here." "I don't know exactly how far that is." "About 40 miles. She absorbed that, set it somewhere. "I didn't realize it had been that many." He should have said something kind or something practical or something that acknowledged what she'd just told him. 40 miles. On a road that turned to mud in the rain, in shoes with a broken heel and a hole in the sole. After 3 days of waiting for a man who never existed. What Gideon Mercer said instead was, "There's dried biscuits and some pork fat if you're hungry." She looked at him. Then, for just a second, not quite a smile but something in that direction, the corners of her mouth moved. "I'm very hungry," she said. It was the closest thing to an ordinary human moment they had shared, and it lasted about half a second before she pressed her lips together and looked away. But it was there, he'd seen it. He got up and found the biscuits. It was while she was eating, mechanically, like someone fueling a machine rather than tasting food, that the thing happened that he didn't expect. She asked him about the letters, not about Calvin Rhodes, about the letters themselves. She asked him to read them, and then she handed the bundle across to him, and he understood that she wasn't asking because she needed them read. She was asking because she'd read them so many times she couldn't see them clearly anymore, and she needed someone else's eyes. He untied the string and read the first one, then the second. By the third one, he had to put them down and look at the wall for a moment, because they were good. That was the obscene thing about it. They were genuinely good letters, warm and funny and specific in the way that meant someone was paying attention to you. They asked about her work, her neighborhood, the smell of spring in Ohio. They remembered things from previous letters and built on them. They talked about the future in language that was careful and hopeful without being reckless. They were the letters of a man who understood loneliness and knew exactly how to speak to it. "He's a good writer," Gideon said. He didn't mean it as a compliment. "I know," she said quietly. "Did you write back to him the same way?" "I tried." She broke off a piece of biscuit. "I'm not good with words. I told him about my work, mostly. What I was sewing, the customers." She paused. "I thought he liked that. The ordinary things." "He probably did," Gideon said. "It made you real to him. Easier to—" He stopped himself. "Easier to what?" He looked at her directly. "Easier to keep doing it. If you're just a name and an address, it's just a game. If you're a real person with ordinary things and customers and a view from your window," he set the letters down. "That's how a man like that justifies it to himself. By making sure you're interesting enough to keep writing to, but never quite real enough that he has to think about what he's doing to you." The room was quiet for a moment. "I sold my sewing machine," she said. "It was a Singer, good condition. I'd saved 4 years for it." She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the fireplace. "And my mother's writing desk. And most of my winter clothes because I thought Montana winters—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. He waited. "I thought I was being practical," she said. "I thought I was being smart about it." He didn't tell her she had been. He didn't tell her she hadn't been either. Both answers would have been insulting, and he wasn't going to insult her. What he said was, "He's the one who wasn't smart about it. He underestimated you." She looked at him. "You're still here," Gideon said. "After all of that, you're still here." She asked to see the fireplace. He thought it was an odd request, and then she picked up the bundle of letters from where he'd set them on the table, walked to the fireplace, and placed them on the remaining coals from the night before. She stood there a moment while the paper caught, not crying, not trembling, just watching. The fire took them fast, 9 months of lies, and they burned in about 45 seconds. When the last corner turned to ash, she put the fireplace screen back in place and turned around. "All right," she said. She straightened her shoulders. "I need to find work. Is there a dressmaker in Willow Ridge or any town close by? Gideon blinked. I can sew anything, she said, with a plainness that wasn't bragging, just fact. Dresses, shirts, mending, curtains, quilts. I'm fast and my seams hold. If there's no dressmaker, there's work to be had anyway. Someone always needs sewing done. He cleared his throat. I believe there's a woman on Fuller Street does alterations. I don't know if she needs help. I'll ask her. You can stay here, he said, while you sort things out. There's the cot. I'll sleep in the barn. I'm not sleeping in your bed while you sleep in a barn, she said. It's not my bed, it's a cot. I sleep in the chair half the time anyway. She looked at him steadily. I'm not a charity project, Mr. Mercer. I know that. I intend work for whatever I use of yours. Meals. The room. I can cook, I can clean, I can repair whatever needs repairing. I'm not saying it to make you feel better. I'm saying it because I don't operate any other way. He studied her face for a moment, the mud still in her hair, the hollows under her eyes, the quiet iron running through the middle of her like a spine. All right, he said. That's fair. She nodded once, like a contract had been signed. Is there a bucket? She asked. I'd like to wash my hair. He found her a bucket. That night, sitting in his chair by the stove while Lydia Rowan slept on the cot across the cabin, Gideon Mercer thought about Calvin Rhodes cutting into that roast at his supper table, laughing at something his youngest said, not thinking about her at all. He thought about the Singer sewing machine she'd saved 4 years for, the mother's writing desk, the winter coat she'd left behind because she thought she was being practical. He thought about 40 miles of mud. He looked at his hands for a while. Rough hands. Cracked at the knuckles in 2 places that never quite healed over. The hands of a man who'd spent 20 years on land that required everything you had, and occasionally more. He hadn't thought about another person this much in a very long time. He put more wood on the fire, sat back down, and didn't examine that too carefully. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. This is a work of fiction created entirely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, and events are imaginary. She was up before him. That was the first thing Gideon noticed when he woke in the gray pre-dawn light. The cot was empty, the blankets folded with a precision that made his own hasty sleeping arrangements look embarrassing, and there was a smell coming from the direction of the stove that it had not produced in a very long time. Something warm, something that required actual effort. He sat up in the chair, every joint in his back announcing its displeasure, and found Lydia Rowan standing at his stove in her travel dress. Still stained, still missing one proper shoe, wearing one of his wool socks on the foot that had lost its shoe entirely, stirring something in the cast iron pot he used mostly for heating water and occasionally for boiling beans until they were soft enough not to break a tooth. She didn't look up when he shifted in the chair. There were oats in the tin on the shelf, she said. I hope that's all right. I also found some dried apple pieces. I wasn't sure if they were for eating or if you were saving them for something. I wasn't saving them for anything, he said. I forgot they were there. She nodded, kept stirring. He watched her work for a moment, the efficient, practiced way she moved around a kitchen that wasn't hers, finding things by logic rather than familiarity, turning the unfamiliar into something functional without making a production of it. She'd found the wooden spoon he'd left in a drawer under a collection of broken harness buckles he'd meant to fix. She'd found the bowls, which were on the wrong shelf given where everything else was, and set them out already. You didn't have to do that, he said. I told you how I operate, she said. He didn't argue. He pulled on his boots and went outside to deal with the horses in the morning, and when he came back 15 minutes later, breakfast was on the table. It was the best thing he'd eaten in longer than he could honestly remember, and it was oatmeal with dried apples. That said something he wasn't going to say out loud. They ate mostly in silence, not the uncomfortable kind, the functional kind, where 2 people are still figuring out the shape of each other and have enough sense not to rush it. Outside, the world was cleaning itself up after the storm, the way it always did, indifferent to whatever had happened to anyone on the road the night before. I'd like to go into town today, Lydia said when the bowls were empty. If you could point me toward the road. Gideon set down his coffee. I'll take you. You don't need to. The road's still bad in 2 spots after rain like that. You'd lose an hour in mud minimum. He paused. And you're still wearing 1 sock. She looked down at her feet. A beat of silence. That's a fair point, she said. He found her an old pair of work boots that had belonged to a ranch hand named Perkins, who'd left them behind 3 years ago when he'd moved on without much warning or explanation. They were 2 sizes too big, but she stuffed the toes with rags and laced them tight and walked in them without complaint, which told him something about how much road she'd already put under her feet in worse conditions. The drive into Willow Ridge took 40 minutes on a good day. With the road in its current state, it took closer to an hour, and Gideon spent a fair portion of that time watching Lydia watch the landscape. She held herself straight on the wagon seat, which looked like habit more than intention. Her hands were in her lap, and she was looking at the mountains the way a person looks at something they've tried to imagine for a long time, and are now discovering the imagination, got it mostly right but wrong in all the specific ways that matter. "It's big," she said at one point. "Montana usually is." "The letters described it." She paused. He was accurate about the mountains, at least. Gideon said nothing to that. They hit the first bad mud spot, and he guided the horses through it with the patience of a man who'd done this several hundred times. Lydia didn't grab for the seat edge or make any sound. She just shifted her weight slightly and let the wagon do what it was going to do. "Did you grow up here?" she asked. "Came out from Illinois when I was 22, he said. "Found work on a cattle operation north of here. Saved enough in 8 years to buy my own parcel." "What made you want to stay?" He thought about that. "First winter almost killed me," he said. "That tends to make a man feel like the place owes him something." She turned to look at him. "That's an interesting way to think about it." "Maybe, but I stayed." She turned back to the mountains. "I almost didn't come," she said. It was quiet, almost to herself. "My neighbor Mrs. Aldrich said I was being a fool, said you couldn't trust a man you'd never met, said the whole arrangement had a smell to it." She paused. "I told her she was being old-fashioned." Gideon kept his eyes on the road. "She was right," Lydia said. Not bitterly, just as fact. "She was right about him," Gideon said. "That's different from being right about you." She looked at him again. He kept his eyes forward. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said. "You trusted a person who spent 9 months working very hard to earn that trust. That's not stupidity. That's just him being better at lying than you were prepared for." The wagon rolled on. After a moment, she said, "Thank you for that. It's just true." Willow Ridge on a Thursday morning was the kind of quiet that passed for busy in a town that size. A few wagons at the rail in front of the general store. 2 women talking outside the post office. A boy sweeping the steps of the barber shop with the specific misery of someone who'd been assigned the task rather than chosen it. Gideon pulled up in front of the general store, and that was the moment things went sideways for the first time. He was tying off the horses when he heard it. Not words exactly, but the drop in volume that happens when a small group of people notice something they find interesting. He turned around and found 3 women on the mercantile porch watching Lydia climb down from the wagon. Not with hostility yet. With the particular sharp attention of people who recognize a piece of information they've been waiting to confirm. One of them was Martha Pell, wife of the town's land agent, who had a gift for being present at every significant moment in Willow Ridge without ever appearing to seek them out. She had the look of a woman who already knew the story and was simply waiting to see how the subject of it was going to conduct herself. Lydia saw them looking. She had to. It was impossible to miss. She straightened her coat, tucked the oversized boots under her as best she could, and walked toward the dry goods half of the store without adjusting her pace. Gideon followed. Inside, the storekeeper, a thin man named Jessup, who had the nervous energy of someone perpetually worried about inventory, looked up from behind the counter. His eyes went from Gideon to Lydia, and something moved across his face that he didn't quite manage to put away in time. "Mercer," he said. "Jessup." Gideon put his list on the counter. "The usual, and whatever the lady needs." Lydia was already at the fabric bolts along the far wall, running her fingers along the edge of a bolt of dark blue wool with the focused expression of someone assessing quality, not admiring it. She turned to Jessup. "Do you carry thread? And needles? The fine ones, not just the heavy gauge?" "We carry some," Jessup said. He hadn't moved yet. "You're the—" He stopped himself. "You came in on Tuesday's train." "Yes," Lydia said. Her voice was even. "I heard you were—" He tried again. "Folks said you'd moved on." "I'm still here," she said. She said it the same way she'd said everything else. simply without invitation for further comment. Do you have the thread or not? He had the thread. What? She found the dressmaker on Fuller Street without any help from Gideon, which he could have predicted if he'd thought about it. The woman's name was Ida Brace, mid-50s, solid and practical, with the squared-off hands of someone who'd been doing fine handwork for decades. She had a small sign in her window and a front room full of dress forms in various stages of completion. Gideon waited outside with the horses. Lydia was in there for almost 20 minutes. He watched the street. A man he didn't know well enough to greet tipped his hat. 2 boys ran past with a dog. Martha Pell came out of the post office, walked to the edge of the porch, and looked in his direction with the expression of someone composing a sentence. He looked back at her with the expression of someone with no interest in hearing it. She went back inside. Lydia emerged from Ida Brace's shop with her chin up and her face arranged in the careful neutral that he was beginning to recognize as what she wore when things hadn't gone the way she'd hoped. No openings, she said when she reached him. I figured there might not be. She was polite about it. Lydia looked down the street. She was polite in the way people are polite when they've already heard something about you and don't want to say so directly. Gideon said nothing. He had heard the same tone many times. She mentioned that Mrs. Holt sometimes needs help with mending, Lydia said, and that the hotel takes in laundry from guests. She said it without inflection, just cataloging. Those are options, he said carefully. I know they are. She looked up at him. I'm not too proud for laundry, if that's what you're thinking. I wasn't thinking that. People always say that right before they offer an opinion about what a woman should and shouldn't do. She caught herself, exhaled. I'm sorry. That wasn't fair. It's all right. It's not, but thank you. She looked back at Ida Brace's window, where the shadow of the woman had appeared and then deliberately moved away. She knows Calvin Rhodes, Lydia said quietly. She sews for his wife. I could see it, the way she didn't quite meet my eye when she said no. Gideon had suspected as much. Let's go to the hotel, he said. The hotel work was 3 days a week, cash paid at the end of each day, which was better than nothing and worse than enough. Lydia took it without ceremony and without complaint. But that night at the cabin, eating the rabbit stew she'd made from the 2 rabbits Gideon had trapped that morning, which was already a marked improvement on anything he'd produced from the same ingredients, she was quieter than usual. Not sad exactly, more like a person doing arithmetic in their head and not liking where the numbers landed. What did you need the sewing machine for? He asked. It came out without much planning. He hadn't intended to ask it. She looked up. For my work. I did alterations and custom pieces. Had a few regular customers. She turned her spoon in the bowl. Some of them had been coming to me for years. Mrs. Feldman used to bring her daughter's dresses in every spring to be let out. The girl kept growing. A pause. I wonder if she found someone else, or if the dresses are just sitting there. There was something in the smallness of that detail that hit him somewhere he hadn't expected. You built something, he said. A whole operation. It wasn't grand. Doesn't have to be grand to be yours. She looked at him steadily. You know, she said, you do that. Do what? Say things that are true without making a fuss about them. She went back to her stew. Most people don't do that. He didn't have anything to say to that either, so he just ate his stew. The second week was when she started on the cabin. He didn't ask her to. He came in from the fence line on a Tuesday afternoon and found her on a step stool she'd fashioned from 2 crates and a plank, pressing new chinking into the gap between the logs on the north wall using a putty knife she'd located in his toolbox. She'd already done a 6-foot section. It was neater work than what was already there. Where did you learn to do that? He asked. My father, she said, without stopping. We had a house that was always needing something. He said knowing how to maintain a thing was more important than knowing how to build one, because you'd spend more years maintaining it. Gideon looked at the section she'd finished. He was right. He usually was. She moved the step stool along the wall. I found the putty in the box under the workbench. I hope that's... It's fine. Use whatever you need. She nodded and kept working. He stood there another moment, watching her, then went to wash up for supper. That night, the north wall of the cabin was noticeably warmer. The following Thursday, he came back from checking on the south pasture fence to find the kitchen windowsill scraped clean and repainted with a small tin of white paint he hadn't known he owned. The week after that, A row of seeds appeared in the dirt beside the porch steps in a careful line. He crouched down to look at them and couldn't identify what they were. "Marigolds," she said from behind him. "Or they will be if they take. I found the seeds in the lining of my travel bag. They must have fallen out of a packet somewhere." She came to stand beside him, looking down at the row. "They probably won't all make it. Some might." "Some might," she agreed. He stood up. They were standing close enough that he could see a smear of white paint on her left wrist that she'd missed when she washed up. He didn't mention it. 3 weeks in, something shifted in the way the cabin felt. Gideon noticed it the way you notice a tooth that stopped hurting. Not the pain, but the absence of it. He'd lived in that cabin for 11 years, and it had always felt like a place he slept and ate and stored things. Functional, the way a tool is functional. Now it smelled like bread twice a week. The windows were clean. The floor had been swept into actual cleanliness rather than the managed chaos he'd maintained. A patched curtain hung in the bedroom doorway that hadn't been there before, made from a piece of fabric she'd traded the hotel laundry work for after the first week. He sat in his chair one evening and looked around the room and had the unsettling experience of seeing it clearly for the first time in years. It wasn't a bad place. He'd just forgotten to see it. Lydia was at the table, by lamplight, doing mending work she'd picked up from 2 different households in town, people who weren't employed by or socially connected to Calvin Rhodes, which was a narrower group than it should have been, but it existed. She'd put the word out quietly, and the work had trickled in. She charged fair prices and delivered when she said she would, and people remembered that. She was working on a shirt with a torn collar, and she was frowning at it in the particular way she frowned when something wasn't going the way she thought it should. "Problem?" Gideon asked. "The weave is wrong for what this person wants. They want it to look like nothing was ever repaired." She turned the collar over. "That's not possible with this tear. The best I can do is make it look like it was repaired by someone who knew what they were doing, which is a different thing." "Will they know the difference?" "Probably not," she admitted. "But I will." He watched her work on it for another few minutes. "How long did it take you," he said eventually, "to get good at it?" She thought about it. "My mother taught me the basics when I was 7 or 8. I was better than her by the time I was 12, which she never admitted, but I could see it in how she'd check my seams." A small pause. "I got good at it the way you get good at anything you do every day, because you have to." She glanced up at him briefly. "How long did it take you to get good at this place?" He considered. "I'm not sure I'm good at it yet." She went back to the collar. "You're still here," she said. "That's what good at it looks like." He sat with that for a while. 4 weeks after he'd found her in the road, Gideon drove Lydia into town on a Saturday because she had 3 items to deliver and 1 to pick up, and because the mud had come back after 2 days of rain and the road was legitimately bad. That was the reason he gave himself, and it was true enough to stand on. The trouble started at the general store. It started the way trouble in small towns always starts. Not with a confrontation, but with a silence, the kind that falls over a room when 2 parties who have been carefully avoiding each other run out of room to avoid. Gideon was at the counter with Jessup when Martha Pell came in with her sister, a woman named Caroline who lived out past the mill and had a mouth that ran faster than her discretion. They saw Lydia first. Lydia was at the fabric wall again, because the Harmon family had asked her to make their daughter a dress for the end of summer gathering, and she was pricing out what she'd need. She didn't see them come in. Caroline Pell said something to her sister in a voice that was designed to be quiet, but was actually designed to be heard. The specific words, later, Gideon couldn't have repeated exactly. But the shape of them was clear enough. The mail-order woman, the one nobody actually wanted. Still here, apparently. "What do you think she's—" Lydia heard it. He knew she heard it because her hand stilled on the fabric bolt for just a half second before she continued running her fingers along the edge, measuring by touch. She did not turn around. She did not respond. She finished what she was doing, noted the price on the bolt with a small pencil stub from her coat pocket, and walked to the counter to ask Jessup to put 12 yards on the Harmon account. Gideon watched Caroline Pell watch her, and he watched the expression on Caroline Pell's face move through a brief, unguarded surprise. She'd expected a reaction, and not getting one had thrown her, before settling back into something cooler and more deliberate. On the way out of the store, Lydia's face was what it always was. Arranged, steady, the careful neutral he'd come to recognize. He waited until they were back at the wagon. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. Short, final. He didn't push. He untied the horses. I'd like to go to the post office, she said. I'm writing to Mrs. Aldrich. She'll want to know I'm alive. All right. They walked to the post office. On the way, two people they passed greeted Gideon by name, and their eyes slid past Lydia as if she were a gap in the landscape rather than a person standing beside him. Gideon stopped. Miss Rowan, he said deliberately to both of them, has been helping with work in the area. Good seamstress. If you or yours need any mending done, she's worth asking. One of the men, Harlan Greaves, who Gideon would later recall as a friend of Calvin Rhodes's, looked briefly uncomfortable and mumbled something that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite refusal, and then they moved on. Lydia didn't say anything until they were inside the post office. You don't have to do that, she said quietly. I know, he said. People will talk. They're already talking. She looked at him. He looked back. I know what they're saying, he said, and I know what's true. Those are two different conversations, and I'm only interested in one of them. She held his gaze for a moment, then she went to the counter to send her letter. What he hadn't told her was what happened the following Tuesday. He'd gone into town alone to deal with a feed bill, and he'd run into Calvin Rhodes outside the land agent's office. Rhodes had looked him over with the particular discomfort of a man who suspects the person in front of him knows something unflattering. Mercer, he'd said. Rhodes. An ordinary exchange, on the surface. Men who knew each other passing on a street. But Calvin Rhodes had then said, casually, with a small smile that was mostly habit, I heard you've been putting up that woman who came in on the train last month. The Ohio woman. He'd arranged his expression into something between concern and amusement. People are going to get the wrong idea. Gideon had looked at him for a moment. The wrong idea, he repeated. You know how this town talks. I do, Gideon said. I also know that you wrote 9 months of letters to that woman under a false name, built up a future she believed in, and then sat at home eating supper while she walked 40 miles alone in the rain. The smile on Calvin Rhodes's face had a complicated few seconds. I don't know what she told you, Rhodes said, and his voice had shifted into something lower and more careful. But I wouldn't take the word of a woman in her situation over. I read the letters, Gideon said. Silence. Your handwriting, Gideon said. I've seen it on your invoices. Same F on the lowercase, same break in the capital T. He hadn't actually confirmed this with certainty, but he was confident enough. You're a careful man, Calvin. Careful about most things. You weren't careful about that. Rhodes was quiet for a long moment. The street moved around them. A wagon went by. She's got no standing here, Rhodes said finally. His voice had gone flat. She's got no family, no property, no claim. Whatever she thinks she came here for, she's got nothing. She's got a job, Gideon said, and a reputation that's already better than yours, if anyone ever checks the actual facts. He picked up his feed order. Don't make me check the actual facts, Calvin. He walked back to the wagon. He didn't tell Lydia about it when he got home. She'd made cornbread that evening, and they ate it with the last of the pork he'd smoked in the fall. And she asked him about the south fence he'd been repairing, and he told her about the section that had collapsed in the spring and never properly gotten fixed, and she listened the way she listened to everything, with actual attention, as if the facts mattered to her. He didn't tell her about Rhodes because there was no version of that conversation that made her feel better. It would only confirm what she already knew, and add the weight of knowing that the man had been within a few miles of her this whole time, eating supper and going to the land agent's office and existing without consequence. Some things you kept to yourself, not because the other person couldn't handle them, but because they'd already handled enough. The real trouble began on a Friday, 3 days later. Not with words this time, words he could manage. It began with the way Lydia came back from her hotel laundry work that evening, 40 minutes later than usual, which alone was enough to make him look up from the fence post he was setting in the yard. She came down the road on foot, the way she always did, but her pace was different, faster than necessary, and her arms were crossed in front of her chest, even though the evening wasn't cold. He waited. She came through the gate, and he could see her face properly then, and what was on it was something he hadn't seen there before. Not the careful neutral. Something that hadn't been arranged yet, something still raw. What happened? He asked. She stopped a few feet away, looked at him, and for a moment he thought she wasn't going to say it, was going to push it down into whatever place she kept the things she didn't say. I was let go from the hotel work, she said. Mrs. Garner said they've decided not to take in outside laundry for the time being. She paused. She had the grace to look sorry about it. I'll give her that much. Gideon put down the fence post. Calvin Rhodes uses that hotel, he said. I know. His brother-in-law owns half of it. I know that too. She looked away toward the line of trees at the edge of the property. It was 3 days a week and it wasn't enough money anyway. I'm not… She stopped. I'm angry, she said, with a directness that surprised him. I'm just angry. I don't have anywhere useful to put it right now. That's all right. It's not all right, Gideon. None of this is all right. She turned back to him. I came to this state to build a life, not to be erased from every room I walk into because some man with a comfortable house is embarrassed. I exist. She said it without tears, which somehow made it worse. The particular fury of a woman who'd cried everything she had and was left with just the anger. No, he said, it's not all right. They stood there in the cooling evening, the unfinished fence post between them. Come eat something, he said. Then we'll figure it out. She looked at him for a long moment. You don't have to keep doing this, she said. Standing beside me like it costs you nothing. It costs you something, Gideon. I can see it. Maybe, he said. But you're still here, and so am I. She held his gaze. Then she turned and walked toward the cabin, and he picked up the fence post and drove it into the ground. And by the time he came inside, she had the stove going and was measuring out what was left of the flour, and neither of them said another word about it that night. But it sat in the room between them, that sentence she'd said, and the one he'd said back, like a lamp left burning. Present. Visible to both of them. Not quite ready to be looked at directly, but impossible to ignore. Outside, the first marigold had pushed a pale green shoot up through the dirt beside the porch steps. It was small and a little lopsided, and there was no guarantee at all that it would last. But it was there. This is a work of fiction created entirely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, and events are imaginary. The marigold didn't die. Gideon had expected it to, if he was honest. The soil beside the porch steps was compacted and thin, and the season was already past the point when most things planted had a reasonable chance. But the shoot thickened over the following 2 weeks, and then a second one appeared an inch to the left of the first. And by the time October settled in with its particular cold clarity, there were 7 plants in that row, none of them especially robust, all of them stubbornly present. He noticed them every morning when he went out to deal with the horses. He didn't mention them. Neither did Lydia. But he'd seen her crouch down beside them twice, checking the soil with 2 fingers the way his mother used to check bread dough, and that was enough. The Harmon dress had been delivered on time and fit the daughter perfectly, which was the kind of outcome that traveled through a small community faster than any advertisement. Within a week, Lydia had 2 more commissions. A woman named Bertie Schultz, who needed a winter coat altered for her mother, and a young man engaged to be married who wanted his father's old suit made wearable for the occasion. Neither of them were in Calvin Rhodes's immediate circle, but they weren't outside it either. They were the people in between, the ones who made their decisions based on the practical reality of what they needed rather than the social weather of the moment. Lydia worked on both commissions at the table by lamplight after supper, and Gideon had stopped pretending he was going to bed before she finished. He sat in his chair with whatever needed mending or reading, and they worked in the same room, in the same comfortable silence they'd arrived at without discussing it. It wasn't nothing, that silence. He understood that much. What he didn't understand yet was how much it would cost them both when it shattered. The Willow Ridge Savings Bank was robbed on a Wednesday night in the 3rd week of October. Gideon heard about it Thursday morning from a man named Tuck Bigelow, who ran cattle on the eastern parcel and stopped by occasionally to check on a boundary marker they shared. Tuck was not a man given to excitement, which made his version of events more reliable than most. Took the safe clean, Tuck said, standing by the fence with his hat in his hands. Night watchman got hit on the head. He's all right, but he was out for a while. Whoever did it knew the layout. Anyone see anything? Gideon asked. Old Emmett Stokes claims he saw a woman crossing the side lot near the bank around 9 o'clock. Says she was a stranger. Tuck paused. You know Emmett. He's about half blind and 3/4 certain about everything he sees. Gideon said nothing, but something in his chest went very still. What did she look like? He asked. According to Emmett, Tuck shifted his weight. He said she was youngish, dark hair, traveling clothes. He looked at Gideon carefully. He said she didn't look like she was from around here. There it was. Gideon kept his face even. Emmett Stokes once reported a bear in his yard that turned out to be his own dog wearing a saddle blanket. Tuck almost smiled. That's true. But people are scared, and scared people need somewhere to put it. He looked toward the cabin. Just thought you should know what's going around. After Tuck left, Gideon stood by the fence for a long while before going back inside. Lydia was at the table working on Bertie Schultz's coat alteration. She looked up when he came in, read something in his face, and put down her scissors. What happened? She said. He told her. All of it, including Emmett Stokes's description. He didn't see any point in softening it, because softening it would only mean she found out the harder version later from someone with less reason to be careful about how they said it. She was quiet while he talked. When he finished, she sat back in her chair and looked at the coat on the table. Dark hair, she said, traveling clothes. That's what he said. Half the women who come through on the train have dark hair and traveling clothes. I know that. She looked up at him. You believe me. I know where you were Wednesday night, he said. You were here. You went to bed before I did. I heard you get up at some point and get water, and I heard you go back to the cot. He said it plainly, because that was the truth, and it didn't need decoration. You didn't leave this cabin. She absorbed that. Something in her face shifted. Not relief exactly, because there was still fear underneath it, but something like gratitude that had no good place to land. That doesn't mean they'll believe you, she said. No, he said. It doesn't. Sheriff Boone Callahan rode out to the property on Friday afternoon. Gideon had met him twice before. Once at a property line dispute 3 years back, and once when a horse had gone missing from a neighboring parcel and the sheriff had ridden around asking standard questions. Callahan was a careful man, the kind who moved slowly, not because he was slow, but because he'd learned that people relaxed when you didn't press too hard too fast, and relaxed people told you more. He was polite. He accepted the coffee Lydia offered without hesitation, which Gideon noted as a deliberate choice. A man who thought she was a criminal wasn't going to drink her coffee in her kitchen. He asked her questions in the measured tone of someone who already had most of the answers and was checking the ones he didn't. Where had she been Wednesday evening? What time had she gone to bed? Had she heard anything unusual? Did she know anyone at the bank? Had she been in that part of town recently? Lydia answered everything directly, without volunteering extras, without being evasive. She had the careful precision of a woman who understood that too many words looked like a performance, and too few looked like concealment. She gave him exactly what he asked for, and nothing beyond it. Gideon confirmed her account when Callahan turned to him. Same timeline, same details. The sheriff wrote things in his small notebook with a pencil. He was quiet for a moment after he'd finished. Miss Rowan, he said, I want to be straight with you. I'm not here because I think you did this. I'm here because people are asking me questions, and I'm required to answer them. And to answer them, I need to ask you some of mine. He closed the notebook. But I'll tell you honestly that Emmett Stokes's account is not something I'd hang a conclusion on. The man gets confused. I've seen it. Thank you for saying so, Lydia said. That said, Callahan continued, and here his voice took on the particular careful tone of a man delivering a warning he doesn't want to have to repeat. The conversation in town isn't going to go quiet just because I'm satisfied. People are frightened about the bank. They want an explanation. If I can't give them one fast, they'll go looking for their own. He looked at Gideon. You understand what I'm telling you? I understand, Gideon said. After Callahan left, they sat at the table for a while without talking. The coat alteration was still laid out where Lydia had left it. She didn't pick it up. He was kind, she said finally. Kinder than he needed to be. He's a fair man. Fair doesn't always win, she said. She was looking at the table. I've been thinking. She pressed her hands flat on the surface. If I left, moved on to another town, another county. No, Gideon said. I'm not asking for your... No, he said again. Listen to me. He leaned forward. If you disappear right now, the story writes itself. You become the woman who ran. That follows you. It follows you to the next town, and the one after that. You'll spend the rest of your life outrunning a version of events that isn't true, and every time it catches up, it'll have grown. He looked at her steadily. I know something about running from a place, Lydia. It doesn't work the way you think it will. She looked at him. What did you run from? He hadn't planned to say it. He'd carried it the way he carried most things, quietly, in the part of himself he didn't routinely open to inspection. But she'd asked him directly, and she wasn't the kind of person you answered sideways. I had a wife, he said, and a daughter, back in Illinois. He kept his voice even. There was a fever that went through the county in the spring of 1871. He stopped, restarted. My daughter was 3. My wife had been sick for 2 weeks already, trying to take care of her. It was 4 days apart. The room was very quiet. After the funerals, he said, I sold everything and came west. I told myself it was practical, that there was opportunity out here, that there was work, that it made sense. He looked at his hands. The truth is, I couldn't stand to be in any room where I'd lived with them. I couldn't drive down a road we'd driven on together. I left because the grief was attached to the geography, and I thought if I changed the geography, I'd leave the grief behind. He paused. I didn't. You don't. It just rides with you in a smaller package. Lydia was watching him. She didn't say she was sorry, which he was grateful for. He'd heard enough of that in 1871 to last several lifetimes. What she said was, Is it better now, after all this time? Some days, he said honestly. Some days it's just quieter. He looked at her. But I'm glad I'm here. I'm glad I stayed after that first winter. If I'd kept running, he shook his head. I don't know what I'd be by now. She nodded slowly. So stay, he said. Not for me. Stay, because running solves the wrong problem. She looked at the table for a long moment. Then she picked up the coat alteration and turned it in her hands, checking the seam she'd left unfinished. All right, she said quietly. He exhaled. But if it gets worse, she said, we talk about it again. Fair, he said. She threaded her needle. Well, it got worse within the week. The Harmon Commission, the dress that had been her first real success in Willow Ridge, was canceled. No reason given in the note that arrived with the dress returned, the seams still intact, the work obviously untouched. Just a few words from Mrs. Harmon explaining that they'd decided to hold off on the end of summer gathering this year and would not be needing the dress after all. There was no end of summer gathering to hold off on. The event had already happened 2 weeks prior. The dress came back folded in paper and tied with string, and Lydia stood at the table holding it for a moment before she set it down and went to the window. Gideon read the note twice. Calvin Rhodes is friends with Henry Harmon, he said. They hunt together. I figured as much, she said. She was watching something in the yard, or watching nothing, which was possible too. Bertie Schultz hasn't canceled, he said. Not yet. She won't, he said. Bertie Schultz doesn't care what Calvin Rhodes thinks about anything. She told me once she's known him since he was 12 and he's never once surprised her in a good direction. That almost got a response from Lydia. The corner of her mouth moved. The young man with the suit, he said. Michael Purdy. He's not connected to Rhodes. He's connected to everyone through someone, she said. That's what small towns are. She turned from the window and sat down. She looked tired in a way that wasn't about sleep. The accumulated weight of weeks of being watched and whispered about and maneuvered around. The particular exhaustion of a person who has to be careful in public every single day. Tell me something that isn't about this, she said. He thought about it. The gray mare might be pregnant, he said. She looked at him. Chalk? Not Chalk, the other one. Etta. How can you tell? She's been eating more and moving differently. I'm not certain, but I've seen it before. Something in Lydia's face shifted, a genuine interest arriving, cutting through everything else. How far along? If I'm right, maybe 3 months. She'd foal in late winter or early spring. Have you had a foal on this property before? Once, the first year. Didn't go well. He didn't elaborate. Can it go well? If she's healthy and the timing's decent, yes, usually does. She looked toward the window in the direction of the corral where Etta would be. I'd like to be there when it happens, she said, if I'm still here. You'll still be here, he said. She looked at him. You sound very sure. I am. She didn't push it, but something in the set of her shoulders changed, and she reached across the table and pulled the returned Harmon dress toward her, turning it over in her hands. looking at it not as a failure, but as material, as fabric that could be used for something else. "The lining is good," she said. "I can salvage this." He nodded. She found her seam ripper. The break-in was what accelerated everything. 6 days after the sheriff's visit, on a Thursday night when Gideon was in town dealing with a lumber order that had been delayed, someone got into the small outbuilding behind the dry goods store where Jessup kept overflow stock. 2 crates of canned goods, a roll of copper wire, and a cash box that held approximately $40 were taken. The witness this time was not Emmett Stokes. The witness was a 14-year-old boy named Ray Jessup, the storekeeper's son, who'd been out past his curfew for reasons he declined to fully explain and had seen, from across the alley, a figure moving near the outbuilding. He described a woman, medium height, dark clothing, moving quickly. By the time Gideon got back to the cabin that night, the news had already reached the outer properties. Tuck Bigelow had sent his hired hand down the road to pass along the word. He went inside and found Lydia at the table. She had a candle burning and she was writing a letter, and when she looked up at him, her face had already done the calculation. "Another robbery," she said. It wasn't a question. "Outbuilding behind Jessup's store, Thursday night." "What time Thursday night?" "They're saying around 8. "I was here," she said. "I know." He hung up his coat. "I was in town." "I know," she said. She set down her pen. "They won't all believe you." "Some won't." "Gideon." She looked at him directly. "Someone is doing this deliberately, not just the robberies. Someone is doing this in a way that keeps pointing toward me." He'd had that thought too, on the ride home. He'd been turning it over. 2 incidents, both at night, both witnessed by someone who described a woman matching Lydia's general description without being specific enough to be useful. And the descriptions were not identical, but consistent in the ways that mattered. "Calvin Rhodes," he said. "I've thought about that," she said. "But he'd be putting himself at risk. If anyone connected him to the robberies—" "He's not doing the robberies," Gideon said. "I don't think he's behind those at all. I think what he's doing is simpler than that. He's making sure that when people describe what they saw, the description they settle on points somewhere useful to him." He sat down. "He doesn't need to be the one doing it. He just needs to be the one standing at the edge of the conversation, nudging it." She was quiet. He watched her think through it. "If that's true," she said, "then it doesn't matter how many times I account for my time. There will always be another incident, and the description will always be close enough." "Not forever," he said. "Whoever's actually doing this will get caught eventually, or make a mistake, or move on. Real criminals don't stay in one place long." "And until then?" He looked at her. "Until then, we're careful, and we're visible, and we don't give anyone a story they can use." She folded her letter without finishing it. He noticed it was addressed to Mrs. Aldrich in Ohio. "You were telling her you were all right," he said. She looked at the letter. "I was telling her I had work and a place to stay, and that the mountains are in fact as large as the letters described." A pause. "I was being optimistic." "Is that a lie?" She considered. "No," she said slowly. "It's selective. There's a difference. There is." She put the letter aside. "I'll finish it tomorrow." She stood up. "I'm going to bed." She passed by the table on her way to the back of the cabin, and she paused beside his chair. She didn't touch him, didn't say anything. She just stopped there for a moment, the way a person stops beside a fire to absorb the warmth before going back out into the cold. And then she continued on. He sat in the quiet for a long while after that. Saturday brought Caroline Pell and 2 of her regular companions to the dry goods store at the same time. Lydia was there picking up thread for the Purdy suit alterations. This time Caroline didn't lower her voice. She said clearly enough that Jessup froze behind his counter. "It's a wonder some people have the nerve to show their faces in a public store." Lydia was at the far end of the counter. She turned around slowly. Gideon was 2 feet to her right, and he watched the careful neutral arrive on her face. Watched her construct it in real time, piece by piece, the way a person puts on armor they've had to wear enough times that they're fast at it now. But something was different this time. She looked at Caroline Pell for a moment, not with anger, and not with the blankness she usually deployed. She looked at her with something that Gideon recognized after a second as pity, genuine and quiet and not unkind. "I hope you find some peace, ma'am," Lydia said. Caroline Pell blinked. It was not the response she'd prepared for. "I beg your—" "I'm not saying it to be insulting," Lydia said. "I'm saying it because the only reason a person needs to make another person feel small is that they're feeling small themselves. I don't know what that is for you, and it's not my business." She turned back to the counter. "2 spools of dark thread, please, Jessup. The heavier gauge this time." The store was completely silent. Jessup found the thread with the speed of a man desperate to end the scene he was standing in the middle of. Caroline Pell said nothing else. She left the store before Lydia did, and the sound of the door closing behind her seemed to take the pressure out of the room. Gideon paid for the thread without speaking. Outside at the wagon, he untied the horses with his back to her for a moment, giving her whatever she needed. "That was probably unwise," Lydia said behind him. "Probably," he agreed. "She'll be talking about it before she reaches the corner." "Yes. I don't regret it." He turned around. "Good." He looked at her. It was the right thing to say. She took the thread from him and set it in the wagon bed. "I'm so tired," she said. Not dramatically, just a fact stated clearly, the way she stated most things. "I know," he said. "Not of here," she said quickly. "Not of the cabin, or the work, or—" She stopped herself. "Just of being looked at like that. Like I'm a problem that arrived rather than a person who did." He didn't have a good answer for that. The only honest thing he could say was that he saw her as a person, had from the first night, from the moment she'd asked for a bucket to wash her hair. But saying so felt simultaneously too large and not large enough for what the moment required. So he said, "Get in the wagon. I'll take us back the long way, along the creek road. Less mud." She looked at him. "You'll be out of town faster," he said, "and you'll get 15 minutes of something decent to look at." She got in the wagon. The creek road wound along the bottom of the valley where the cottonwoods had gone gold at the edges, and the water ran clear over the stones, and there was nothing along it that could look at Lydia Rowan with anything but the complete indifference of the natural world, which Gideon had always found was its own kind of comfort. She didn't say anything for most of the drive. Neither did he. At one point, crossing the shallow ford where the road dipped through a bend in the creek, she put her hand on the side of the wagon seat, not grabbing for support, just resting it there, and didn't move it for the rest of the drive. He didn't look at it, but he was aware of it. That night, after supper, she brought up the idea of leaving again. Not the same way as before. Not as a solution or even as a plan. More like a weight she was putting on the table to see how heavy it actually was. "If it doesn't resolve," she said, "if whoever is doing these robberies isn't caught, and the descriptions keep pointing at someone like me, and Calvin Rhodes keeps standing at the edge of conversations nudging them in my direction, at some point it becomes untenable. You know that." "At some point," he said. "Yes." "What's your point? When does it become that?" He thought about it honestly. "When it stops being just whispers and starts being official," he said. "If Callahan comes back here with something more than Emmett Stokes and a 14-year-old boy, then we're dealing with a different problem. But we're not there. Yet." "Yet," he agreed. She was quiet. Then, "What would you do? If I weren't here? If this were just your property and your problem?" "Dig in," he said, "same as I always have." Is that wisdom or stubbornness? Sometimes they look the same from the outside. She almost smiled. It was brief, the way her smiles were, but he was learning to catch them. "I'm not going anywhere yet," she said. "I just needed to say it out loud so it didn't sit so heavy." "Say it out loud whenever you need to," he said. "That's what the table is for." She looked at the table, then at him. "When you're alone," she said, "and you don't have anyone to say things to, what do you do with them? The things that sit heavy?" He looked at the fire. "Mostly I just carry them," he said. "I'm not sure I had another option for a long time." He turned back to her. "That's what I was doing before you got here, just carrying them, getting good at it." She held his gaze. "That sounds like a very lonely thing," she said. "It was," he said, and he let that sit there, honest and plain, without apology or performance. The fire shifted in the stove. The cabin held its warmth the way it had learned to hold warmth since the north wall got patched. Better than before, still imperfect, but better. Outside, the marigolds were small dark shapes in the night, closed against the cold, waiting for morning to open again. They were still there. Both of them, still there. This is a work of fiction created entirely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, and events are imaginary. The night Lydia almost left, it was raining again. Not the brutal storm that had put her in the road 2 months prior. This was quieter, the kind of November rain that didn't announce itself, just arrived and settled in with the intention of staying. Gideon woke to it sometime past midnight, and what woke him wasn't the sound of the rain, but the absence of another sound. The particular quality of silence that a cabin has when you're the only one breathing in it. He was off the chair before he'd fully thought it through. The cot was empty. The blankets were folded, same as always, with that precise habit she couldn't seem to turn off even under duress. Her coat was gone from the peg by the door. One of the 2 canvas bags she'd arrived with was gone from the corner where she kept it. He stood in the middle of the cabin for a moment, his boots unlaced, his coat half on, and felt something move through him that he hadn't felt in a long time. Not panic exactly, more like the recognition of a specific kind of loss arriving before it had technically completed itself. He went out the door. She was on the porch, not on the road, not already gone, sitting on the top step in the dark with the missing bag beside her and her coat buttoned to the collar, looking out at the rain like she was having an argument with it, and neither side was winning. He stood in the doorway. She didn't turn around. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "I noticed." "I wasn't leaving," she said. Then a pause. "I was deciding whether to leave. There's a difference." He came out and sat on the step beside her, which put them both in a position to get rained on, since the porch overhang had a gap in it that he'd never gotten around to fixing. Neither of them moved. "What were you deciding?" he asked. She was quiet for long enough that he could hear the rain finding its way through the overhang gap and hitting the step below them in a thin stream. Her hands were in her lap, one over the other. "Sheriff Callahan sent word this afternoon," she said. "While you were with the South Fence, Tuck Bigelow's hired hand brought it." Gideon looked at her. "Received a formal complaint from the bank, from their regional officer, not from Callahan himself. They want—" She stopped, started again. "They want me to come in for official questioning, not a conversation, official questioning. There's a difference in how they say it and what it means." He hadn't known about this. Something tightened in the back of his jaw. "When?" "Monday morning." She turned her head slightly, not quite looking at him. "That gives me 2 days. If I left tonight, I'd have most of a day's distance before anyone organized to follow, if anyone even thought to. I could be in the next county by Sunday evening. I know someone in Colorado, a woman I worked with in Ohio who moved out there 2 years ago. She'd take me in." He listened to all of it. "And what does staying look like?" he asked. "Staying looks like sitting in front of a bank officer on Monday who's been told a version of events by people with more money and standing than I have, and trying to convince him that I know nothing about 2 robberies using nothing but the word of a man who is—" She stopped herself. She turned and looked at him directly. "Gideon, I need you to hear what I'm saying. I'm not saying you're not enough. I'm saying that to the bank officer, you might not be. That's not about you." "I know that," he said, "because I won't have you sacrifice your standing in this county over Lydia." His voice was quiet, but it had a weight to it that stopped her. "I've had this piece of land for 11 years. I've been the man people pass on the street for 11 years. I know exactly what my standing is worth to me versus what—" He stopped. He looked at the rain for a moment. "I need you to let me decide what I'm willing to put on the table. That's not your decision." She looked at him. "I'm not a cause," she said. It was careful, deliberate. "I need you to know that. I'm not something you're rescuing. I came here in a bad situation, and you helped me, and I'm grateful. But I won't have you making decisions based on some obligation that doesn't exist. If you stood beside me because you thought you had to, that's not why," he said. The rain came through the gap in the overhang. "Then why?" she said. He'd known the question was coming. He'd known it the way you know a fence post is going to give before it actually does. The wobble in it, the angle of lean. He'd been not answering it for 2 months, moving around it carefully in the dark, and now it was sitting right in front of him in the rain on his own porch steps. "Because I haven't wanted anyone to stay before," he said. "Since Illinois. Not like this." He kept his eyes forward. "I'm not saying it to change what you decide tonight. I'm saying it because you asked me directly, and I'm not going to lie to you, and that's the truth." She didn't say anything for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was different. I found your wife's name, she said quietly. In the Bible on the shelf. Margaret Elaine Mercer. And your daughter's. Clara. She paused. I wasn't snooping. I was dusting and it fell open. I should have told you I'd seen it. He hadn't known she knew their names. Something about hearing them said out loud in another person's voice, after so many years of them living only in his own head, made his chest do something complicated. Margaret would have liked you, he said. She had no patience for people who talked around things. She always said cowardice looked worse in words than it did in actions. He exhaled slowly. She was usually right. Lydia looked down at her hands. Clara, she said, just the name, just acknowledging it. She would have been 22 this November, he said. Neither of them said anything after that for a while. The rain made it sound, and the darkness held everything in it, and somewhere in the corral Etta shifted her weight with a soft sound that carried. Then Lydia picked up the bag beside her, stood up, and carried it back inside. He listened to her set it back in the corner, heard the rustle of her coat coming off, heard the soft weight of her settling back onto the cot. He sat on the porch for another few minutes, alone with the rain and the dark. Then he went back inside too. Monday came with cold, clear light and no wind, which was the only charitable thing about it. Gideon drove the wagon into Willow Ridge with Lydia sitting straight-backed beside him in the blue wool coat she'd accepted 3 weeks ago from Bertie Schultz, who'd said her mother had two and this one was sitting unused. Lydia had spent 2 evenings taking it in at the seams and replacing the buttons, and it fit her now like it had been made for her, which was usually how things went when she put her hands on them. She'd said almost nothing on the drive in. Not the comfortable silence, not the thinking silence, the particular silence of a person marshaling everything they have for something they're not sure they can win. He'd said almost nothing either. There wasn't much useful to say. Sheriff Callahan was waiting outside the bank with a deputy. Gideon didn't know well. A young man named Freese who looked like this was not the posting he'd had in mind when he'd taken the job. Callahan greeted them both without ceremony and led them inside. The bank officer from the regional office was named Alderton. He was precisely the kind of man you'd expect to occupy that position. Not unkind, not cruel, but constructed entirely from procedure and institutional caution. Someone who had learned to interact with the world through forms and precedents until those forms had become the world. He had a suit that cost more than anything Gideon owned, and the manner of a person who considered time a limited resource and other people's feelings a variable expense. He sat across the table from Lydia and asked his questions. She answered them. All of them. Dates, times, location. Who she'd been with, who could confirm it, what she'd done each evening of each incident. Gideon sat beside her and confirmed her account twice when Alderton turned to him with the particular skeptical politeness of a man who had already formed a lean in one direction and was going through the motions of balance. What happened next was the first thing that day that Gideon hadn't anticipated. Callahan spoke. He'd been quiet through most of it, but now he opened his notebook and put it on the table and walked Alderton through something with the patient, methodical precision of a man who'd been working toward this moment for longer than the meeting. The timeline of both incidents, mapped against the witness accounts. The specific inconsistencies in Ray Jessup's description when compared to the bank robbery witness, which Callahan had apparently identified and documented without making any announcement about it. The fact that both locations had been accessed by someone with working knowledge of the town's layout, not an outsider learning it, but someone who knew exactly where the gaps were. The woman these witnesses described, Callahan said, left the scene on foot both times. No horse, no wagon. Miss Rowan has no access to a horse other than Mr. Mercer's animals, which were on his property both evenings, as I've confirmed with Mr. Tuck Bigelow's hired man who passed by that road both nights. He turned a page. Furthermore, both incidents show a particular pattern of access that suggests familiarity with the owner's scheduling habits. I've been looking into who would have that knowledge. Alderton looked at him. And? I have some names, Callahan said. None of them are Miss Rowan. The room was very quiet. Lydia's hands were in her lap under the table. Gideon could see from the angle that they were pressed flat against her knees, not gripping, just held still, the way she held things still when she didn't want them to show. Alderton was quiet for a moment, doing the arithmetic of institutional embarrassment versus practical resolution. You're telling me this process has been premature, he said. I'm telling you, Callahan said, without particular emphasis, that Miss Rowan has answered every question asked of her on 2 separate occasions, and that her account is consistent and corroborated. I'm also telling you that the actual investigation is ongoing and moving in a productive direction. He closed the notebook. I'm not in the business of pursuing people for the convenience of having someone to pursue. Alderton looked at Lydia. Something in his face shifted. Not apology. The man didn't seem built for apology, but a recalibration. Miss Rowan, he said, I appreciate your cooperation with this process. It was all he said. It was, Gideon thought, all he was capable of saying. On the way out of the bank, on the front steps, with the cold November light on both their faces, Lydia stopped and stood still for a moment with her eyes closed. Just a moment. Then she opened them. Callahan, she said when the sheriff came out behind them. Thank you. He looked at her. I'm doing my job, he said. I'd have done the same for anyone. I know, she said. That's why I'm thanking you. He nodded and went back inside. Gideon watched him go. He's been working on this, Gideon said. Yes, she said. He didn't tell us. He didn't want to give us something to hope for in case it didn't hold, she said. She looked across the street. I understand that. He looked at her profile. Are you all right? She considered the question honestly, the way she considered everything. I'm relieved, she said, and I'm angry, and I'm tired. And somewhere underneath all of that, She paused. I'm not sure what the word is. Something like grateful, but that's not quite right either. Still here, he said. She turned to look at him. That's the word, he said. Still here. She held his gaze for a moment. Yes, she said quietly. Still here. What followed was not immediate. That was the thing about small towns. They didn't reverse course all at once. They did it the way water found its way downhill, by degrees and in no straight line, with a great deal of friction along the way. The real bank robbers were caught 11 days later. It happened in the mountains north of the county, where 3 men, 2 brothers named Voss, and a 3rd man with no fixed address who went by a name that wasn't on any official record, had been camping and moving between settlements and had finally made the mistake of attempting a 3rd robbery in a neighboring county where the local sheriff had a deputy who was both fast and competent. They were apprehended with a portion of the Willow Ridge Bank's cash still in their possession, along with tools that matched the marks left on Jessup's outbuilding door. Callahan came out to the property himself to tell them. He arrived mid-morning on a Tuesday, tied his horse at the post, and came to the door with the expression of a man delivering news he's been waiting to deliver. Lydia opened the door before he knocked. She'd heard the horse. It's done, he said. She stood in the doorway. Gideon came up behind her. All 3 in custody, Callahan said. The Voss brothers gave full accounts. No woman involved at any point. He looked at Lydia steadily. Emmett Stokes saw someone that night. I believe that. I just don't believe he saw you. I never did. I know, she said. He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. The bank officer has sent this. It's a formal letter clearing your name from any connection to the investigation. He held it out. You might want to keep it. She took the letter. She held it the way she'd held the bundle of letters from Calvin Rhodes on that first morning, both hands looking down at it. But this was different. Those letters she'd burned. This one she folded carefully and put in the pocket of her dress. Will this change anything? Gideon asked. In town. Callahan thought about it with the honesty of a man who'd been sheriff long enough to know the limits of what official truth could accomplish against accumulated social judgment. Some of it, he said. Not all of it. People who wanted to believe something will find a way to keep some version of it. But most people, he paused. Most people in this town are decent. They got scared and they made assumptions. When they have time to sit with the facts, the decent ones will come around. He tipped his hat to Lydia. I'm glad it went this way, he said. For what it's worth. It's worth a great deal, she said. After he rode out, they stood in the kitchen for a while without doing anything in particular. The letter was in Lydia's pocket. The stove had the mid-morning quiet of something that's been burning long enough to settle into itself. He said most people, Lydia said. He did. Not all people. No. Gideon poured coffee and set 1 cup in front of her. Calvin Rhodes is not going to become a different person because the real robbers got caught. She wrapped her hands around the cup. I know. She looked down at it. I'm not expecting anything from him. I gave up expecting anything from him when I burned his letters. She paused. I'm not even angry at him the way I was. That's the strange thing. He's just a person who did a terrible thing and has to live with that, even if he never admits it to anyone. She shook her head slightly. I feel sorry for his wife. She has to live with it without even knowing what it is. Gideon sat across from her. What do you want to do? He said. Not about him. In general. What happens now, from your end? She looked at him. What do you mean? I mean, you came here to build something, he said. That's still true. The thing that got in your way is gone. What does it look like now? She held the coffee cup, thinking. Her eyes moved to the window, then back to him, with the careful deliberation of someone who has been afraid to plan and is testing whether it's safe to start. I want to keep sewing, she said, not just mending and alterations. I want to build a proper operation. I've been thinking about it for weeks. There's no one in this county doing custom work at a reasonable price. Ida Brace does alterations and she's good at them, but she's not taking on new work and she's older. There's a gap. She paused. I'd need a machine, a singer, ideally. They're expensive. Another pause. And I'd need a proper space. Not a front room in someone else's building, but a real space. That's a lot of need, he said. I know. You could use this table, he said, until you've saved enough for a space of your own. She looked at him. Gideon? You're already using it. You use it every evening. He met her eyes. I'm not offering you charity. I'm pointing out the obvious. She held his gaze for a moment. You said until I've saved enough for a space of my own. That's what I said. You're assuming I'll stay. I'm hoping you'll stay, he said. It was careful and exact. I'm not assuming anything. That's your decision. She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that he could hear the fire in the stove and the wind picking up outside and Etta moving in the corral. The sewing machine first, she said finally. Then we talk about the rest. He nodded. That's fair. She drank her coffee. What? The first person to come to the cabin was Bertie Schultz, which surprised no one. Bertie had never fully withdrawn even during the worst of it. She'd kept the mending commission. She'd stopped by twice with things from her kitchen that she described as surplus, which everyone understood was not strictly accurate. She arrived 2 days after the news broke with a jar of preserved plums and the undisguised expression of a woman who is right and knows it and is resisting the urge to say so too loudly. I told Henry Harmon he was a fool, she said, at the door, handing the plums to Lydia. I told him that in my experience, when a man with good social connections points a finger in a particular direction, you should look in the opposite direction. He didn't listen. Come in, Bertie, Gideon said. Bertie came in, sat at the table, and accepted coffee with the ease of a woman who had been entering cabins and sitting at tables for 60 years and had no remaining self-consciousness about any of it. The Harmon girl still needs that dress, she said to Lydia. If you're willing, her mother's embarrassed, but she'll get over it. I still have the fabric, Lydia said. I salvaged it. I knew you would. Bertie looked around the cabin. Her eyes moved over the repaired north wall, the clean windows, the curtain in the doorway, the marigolds. Brought inside now for the cold, sitting in a tin on the windowsill, a little ragged but still blooming in the low winter light. She nodded, once, as if confirming something she'd suspected. This place looks different, she said. It needed some work, Gideon said. Most things do, Bertie said. Most people are too comfortable with the neglect to notice. She picked up her coffee. There'll be others coming, she said to Lydia. Not today. People need a few days to work themselves up to admitting they were wrong, but they'll come. I know, Lydia said. Some of them will bring food, Bertie said. That's how people around here apologize. They feed you. I'm aware. Some of them will bring it and not actually say anything direct about what they're apologizing for. They'll just show up with a pie and talk about the weather. Bertie looked at her over the coffee cup. You'll need to decide in advance whether that's enough for you or whether you require the actual words. Lydia thought about it. I think the pie is enough, she said. Good, simpler that way. Bertie set down the cup. And if anyone makes it complicated, she looked at Gideon. You have people on your side, more than you probably know. Gideon said nothing, but he felt it register somewhere. The way it felt when you'd been cold long enough that you'd stopped noticing, and then a room was warm, and you realized it all at once. They came, as Bertie had predicted. Not all at once, and not all of them, and a few of them came with the specific awkwardness of people doing the right thing against their own preference. But they came. The woman who had spread the cruelest version of the gossip, a person named Dora Marsh, who ran the millinery and had a gift for making information travel, arrived on a Thursday afternoon with a covered dish and the expression of someone preparing for a procedure they'd been putting off. She handed Lydia the dish at the door and said, "Chicken, still hot." Then she stood on the porch for a moment looking at the marigolds in their tin and said quietly, "I shouldn't have said what I said. I can't take it back, but I know I shouldn't have." She turned and left before Lydia could respond to any of it. Lydia brought the chicken inside and stood in the kitchen looking at it. "That was," she started. "I know," Gideon said. She didn't wait for me to say anything. "Some people apologize on their own terms," he said. "I think for Dora Marsh that was hard, coming here at all." Lydia looked at the dish. "It smells good," she said. "She's a decent cook," he said. "I'll give her that." She laughed. It was a real laugh, brief and surprised and unguarded, the kind that escapes before you've decided to let it, and it hit him somewhere low in the chest in a way he didn't examine too carefully. "I don't know how to do this," she said when it subsided. "Be gracious about all of it. I want to be, but I also—" She stopped. "You're allowed to feel both things," he said. "Grateful that people are trying and still sore that they put you through it." "Now is that not hypocritical?" "No," he said. "That's just honest." She looked at him. "You're very good at that." "At what?" "Knowing the difference between things that look similar but aren't." He didn't have much to say to that. He got plates. They ate Dora Marsh's chicken at the table, and it was in fact very good, and outside the window the last of the light was doing something decent with the clouds to the west, and Etta moved in the corral with the particular heaviness of late pregnancy, and the marigolds on the windowsill held their color against the gray of November, with the stubborn small brightness of something that had no reason to still be blooming but was doing it anyway. Emmett Stokes came last. He was 81 years old and had bad eyes and worse knees, and he came on foot, which meant he'd walked about a mile from his nephew's place where he'd been living since the spring. He arrived on a Saturday morning when the first thin snow was on the ground and stood at the door with a trembling handwritten letter folded in both hands. He couldn't quite meet Lydia's eyes. "My nephew helped me write it," he said. "I told him what to put. The words are mine, the hand isn't. I'm sorry for that too." He held the letter out. "I didn't mean to cause harm. I thought I saw something. I've never been certain I saw a woman. I was frightened and people were asking and I said what seemed to fit and I shouldn't have." Lydia took the letter. She looked at it, then at the old man on her doorstep, standing in the thin snow with his hat in his hands, and something crossed her face that Gideon watched with his full attention. "Come inside," she said. "You'll have coffee before you walk back." He looked surprised. "You don't have to." "I know I don't," she said. "Come in, Mr. Stokes." He came in. He sat in Gideon's chair, which was the closest one, and held his hat in his lap and drank the coffee she put in front of him with the careful gratitude of a very old man who has just done the hardest thing he's done in a long time. He stayed 20 minutes. He talked about the weather and the early snow and whether his nephew's mare was going to have a good foal come spring, and Lydia answered everything he said with genuine attention, and by the time he left, some of the trembling had gone out of his hands. Gideon closed the door behind him and turned around. Lydia was at the window watching the old man make his way back down the road in the snow. "That was kind," Gideon said. "He's an old man who made a mistake when he was scared," she said. "He came here on foot in the snow to apologize for it. What else was I going to do?" He looked at her. "A lot of people would have made him feel it more." She turned from the window. "What would that accomplish?" she said. "He already feels it. I could see it on him from the door." She looked at her hands. "I've spent months being judged by people who had the story wrong. I'm not going to do the same thing." He was quiet for a moment. "You know," he said, "when you first got here, I thought the thing that had been done to you was going to make you harder. That's usually what it does." She looked at him. "And?" "And it didn't," he said. "I don't know how you managed that." She was quiet. She looked at the letter in her hand. Emmett Stokes's trembling words, written by someone else's hand. "I didn't decide it," she said finally. "I don't think it's a decision you make. I think it's just—" She set the letter on the table. "I think it's just whether you keep going or you stop." Whether you stay or you don't. She looked up at him. I stayed. He held her eyes. You did, he said. The snow outside the window was still thin, still the season's first attempt, not quite committing yet. The marigolds on the windowsill were smaller than they'd been in October, holding on by something that couldn't quite be called determination, since they were flowers and didn't know what determination was, but it looked like it from the outside. Calvin Rhodes, across town, was at his supper table. Gideon knew that without needing to confirm it. Rhodes was at his supper table and his wife was passing the bread, and his children were saying things that made him laugh. And the story of what he'd done was still living only in the small number of people who knew the actual facts, which was not enough people to constitute consequence. That was still true. It would probably remain true. Gideon had thought about that more than he'd mentioned to Lydia. He'd thought about whether to do something about it, whether there was a version of justice available that didn't require a legal process that would cost Lydia more than it cost Rhodes, whether the truth had a mechanism by which it would eventually surface on its own. He'd arrived, after long consideration, at the conclusion that some men lived their whole lives without paying for what they'd done, and that spending his own life waiting for Calvin Rhodes's reckoning would mean he wasn't spending it on anything worth more than that. There were things worth more than that. They were standing in his kitchen right now, looking at a letter from an old man who'd come in the snow to say he was sorry. I'm going to write to a supplier in Billings, Lydia said, about the sewing machine. I have enough saved for a deposit, I think. It'll take a while to get the rest together, but I'll loan you the difference, Gideon said. She looked at him sharply. Not a gift, he said. A loan, actual terms. You can set them yourself so you know they're fair. I've got money sitting in the bank earning nothing. He met her eyes. It's a practical arrangement. She studied him. He recognized the look. She was checking whether there was something else underneath the practical arrangement, some form of charity or pity wrapped in sensible language. Terms I set myself, she said. In writing if you want. Monthly payment with interest. That's how loans work, he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then she turned to the shelf where she kept her writing things. I'll draft the terms tonight, she said. All right. She sat down at the table and found her paper, and he stood in the kitchen for a moment longer, watching her. Her straight spine, the deliberate way she moved, the quiet industry of a person who had never in her life waited for someone else to build what she needed. He went to add wood to the stove. Outside, the snow was coming down a little heavier now, covering the porch steps, covering the turned earth where the marigold row had been, covering the road that ran north toward his property and south toward Willow Ridge where a man named Calvin Rhodes was having his supper, covering everything equally, the way snow did, indifferent to what lay underneath. Come spring, Gideon thought, the marigolds would come back on their own. Lydia had said that about the seeds, that if the plants had established themselves through a first hard season, they often came back the following year without replanting. They found their own way back. He put the wood in the stove and closed the grate. From the table, he could hear the scratch of Lydia's pen, steady and unhurried, drafting the terms of something that was practical, and also, underneath the practical, was something else entirely. He let it be both things. This is a work of fiction created entirely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, and events are imaginary. The singer arrived on a Tuesday in the second week of March, strapped to the back of a freight wagon that had taken 3 weeks longer than the supplier in Billings had promised, during which time Lydia had checked the road every morning with the particular patience of someone who has learned that things arrive when they arrive and not before. It was heavier than Gideon expected. He and the freight driver got it into the cabin between them, and when it was set on the table, the good table, the one Lydia had been using for every commission since November, she stood beside it for a moment without touching it, just looking. He watched her. She put her right hand on the wheel first, turned it once, slowly, listening to the mechanism. Then she sat down in the chair she'd positioned in front of it 2 days before, when she'd rearranged the cabin to accommodate what wasn't there yet, and she ran a piece of scrap fabric through it with the ease of someone resuming a conversation they'd been forced to pause rather than starting a new one. The seam was straight. Of course it was. All right, she said to herself mostly. She looked up at him. Thank you. The loan, he reminded her. The loan, she agreed. But she said it the way you say something you both know is only partly true. The freight driver had already left. The cabin held the particular quiet of late winter, not the dead quiet of January, but the restless quiet of a season trying to decide if it was done yet. Outside, the ground was still hard in the mornings, but soft by afternoon, and the cottonwoods along the creek road had that faint reddish haze at their tips that meant something was coming, something was getting ready to push through. Lydia worked until past dark that night. He fell asleep in his chair to the sound of the machine and woke to silence and found her still at the table, not sewing anymore, just sitting with her hands in her lap, looking at the window. "Go to bed," he said. "I'm not tired." "You've been up since 4 this morning." She looked at him. "I know, I still can't sleep when I'm thinking." He sat up in the chair and rubbed his face. "What are you thinking about?" She was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Aldrich wrote back," she said. "The letter I sent her in October, the one I told you about. I got her reply last week. I've been carrying it around and not mentioning it because I wasn't sure what I wanted to say about it." "What did she say?" Lydia reached into her dress pocket and unfolded the letter on the table beside the machine. She didn't hand it to him. She looked at it. She said she was glad I was alive. She said she'd worried, that the whole neighborhood had worried when word came back that I'd disappeared from the depot. She smoothed a crease in the paper. She said Mrs. Feldman's daughter had grown out of 2 more dresses, and they'd had to go to a shop on the main street for alterations, and the woman there did indifferent work at twice the price, and Mrs. Feldman complained about it every time she saw Mrs. Aldrich in the street. Despite everything, Gideon almost smiled. And then she said, Lydia stopped, read the line again quietly to herself. Then, she said, "I told you that you couldn't trust a man you'd never met, and I was right about that. But I was wrong that you were being a fool. You were being brave, which is a different thing. I think I confused them because I was frightened for you. I should not have called it foolishness when it was courage of a kind I don't have myself." She set the letter down. "She's 83 years old," Lydia said. "She's never apologized to me for anything in my life, not once. We've known each other for 12 years. Gideon said nothing. He let it sit. "I cried," Lydia said plainly. "I'm telling you because you would have noticed the evidence anyway." She pressed her lips together. "I'm not embarrassed about it. I didn't expect it from her." The people who are hardest to forgive are sometimes the ones who try hardest when they finally understand what needs forgiving, he said. She looked at him. "Is that something you learned or something you figured out?" "Something I figured out," he said. "The slow way, over about 10 years. She folded the letter and put it back in her pocket. She looked at the machine again, at the good table, at the curtain in the doorway she'd made from trade fabric in November. She looked at the marigold tin on the windowsill, which was just dirt now. She'd trimmed the dead plants back in January with the intention of the pot for spring. "I want to write her back," Lydia said. "Tell her about the machine. Tell her things are—" She paused. "Tell her things are different from what I expected. That the mountains are real, and the winters are hard, and the people are complicated, and some of them have been unkind, and some of them have been better than I had any reason to expect." "That's true," he said. "I want to tell her I'm staying," she said. He looked at her. "I haven't told you that directly," she said. "I've been saying things around it for months. The loan, the machine, the terms in writing, but I haven't just said it straight." She met his eyes. "I'm staying, Gideon. This is where I'm staying." He held her gaze. "Good," he said. That was all. But he said it with everything he had, and she knew it, and she nodded once and looked at her letter. "Go to bed," she said. "You have the south fence tomorrow." "I know. I'll be up shortly." He got up and went to the back of the cabin, and he lay down on his bedroll and looked at the ceiling and listened to her moving around the front room. The small sounds of a person tidying the end of a day, extinguishing the lamp, putting things in their places. The sounds of a life that had settled into a space and fit it. He was asleep before she finished. Spring in that part of Montana arrived with no announcement and no grace. It happened in the gaps between other things, while you were dealing with fence posts or feed or the business of keeping animals alive through weather that couldn't decide what it was. You'd look up one afternoon and realize the light had changed, that it was staying longer, that the ground was giving under your boots in a way that was almost pleasant. The marigold seeds came back on their own. Lydia noticed them first, which was fitting. She was coming up the porch steps on a Friday afternoon in late April, carrying fabric samples she'd picked up from Bertie Schultz, who had become something between a supplier and an informal business partner for Lydia's growing commission work, and she stopped on the bottom step and crouched down. He was behind her with the horse. "They're back," she said. He came to look. The same row, in the same thin soil that had no business supporting anything persistent, was showing the same pale green shoots. More of them this time. Not 7, but closer to 12, some paired close together where the seeds had spread. "I told you they would be," he said. "You hoped they would be," she said. "That's different." "Is it?" She straightened up. She looked at the row for another moment, then at the porch, at the repaired overhang gap he'd finally gotten to in February, at the front of the cabin, which didn't look the same as it had when she'd arrived the previous October. It didn't look transformed. It still looked like a working ranch on a modest parcel of land in a county where the winters were long and the margins were thin, but it looked cared for. There was a difference between those two things that most people who hadn't lived both versions wouldn't have been able to articulate. She went inside. He stood on the bottom step for a moment longer, looking at the marigold row. He thought about the night he'd found her in the road, how he'd almost kept riding, how the entire weight of what had become the last 6 months hinged on chalk shying at a shape in the mud and refusing to move. He thought about how many things in life operated that way, not on grand decisions, but on small, involuntary moments, on a horse that stopped, on a letter that fell open to the right page, on a woman who sat on a porch in the rain deciding whether to leave and then didn't. He was a man who believed in the practical rather than the fated. He didn't think the universe had arranged for him to find Lydia Rowan in that road. He thought he'd happened to be on that road at that time, and he'd had enough sense not to keep going. But he also thought there was something worth acknowledging in the fact that sense, in the end, had been enough. That you didn't need fate or fortune. You just needed to stop when something stopped you. Etta foaled in the first week of May. It started at 2 in the morning, and Gideon was in the corral within 10 minutes, having developed the light sleep of someone who's spent enough seasons with pregnant animals to know when something is happening. He sent the ranch hand he'd hired in March, a quiet young man named Dell, who was good with horses and better with machinery, to fetch extra lanterns, and then he was in the stall with Etta, and it was the kind of work that required everything and offered nothing but the outcome. Lydia appeared in the corral doorway 40 minutes in, wearing her coat over her nightclothes and carrying a lantern. "I woke up and you weren't in the cabin," she said. Not accusatory, just explaining. "It's happening," he said. She came to the stall door and watched. He didn't tell her to go back to bed because she wouldn't have, and also because he found suddenly that he wanted her there. Not for any practical reason. Just because this was a hard thing happening in the dark, and she was the person he wanted in the same space as the hard thing. It was another hour. The foal was a filly, dark brown, knock-kneed, objecting strenuously to her own arrival in a way that Gideon found personally encouraging. Etta was exhausted, but intact. Dell got more straw. The filly tried to stand on her third attempt, made it briefly, and then reconsidered. On the fourth attempt, she stayed up. Lydia made a sound that he'd never heard from her before, a small, involuntary sound of something so close to joy it was indistinguishable. "She's enormous," Lydia said. "I didn't think they'd be that big." "She'll seem smaller once she's properly standing," Gideon said. He was leaning on the stall door watching the filly negotiate her own legs. "Though she is on the large side, like her mother. What will you call her?" He thought about it. "That's your territory," he said. "I've never been good at names." She looked at him. "That's not something I should decide." "Why not? You were here." "So was Dell." "Dell named his last horse Wednesday because that's the day it was born," Gideon said. "I'd rather not." She looked at the filly, who had found her mother and was managing the basic requirement of the situation with the single-minded focus of the newly born. Lydia watched for a moment. "Marigold," she said. He looked at her. "It's too long for a horse," he said. "Mary, then. Short for Marigold." She turned to look at him. "Unless you have a serious objection." He looked at the filly. Dark brown, ridiculous legs, completely uninterested in anyone's opinions about her. "Mary," he said. "Mary," she confirmed. Dell, sitting on a hay bale in the corner, said nothing, which was one of the things Gideon appreciated most about Dell. They stayed in the corral until the sky went gray at the edges, when it was clear that Etta was settled, and Mary had the situation under reasonable management. Going back to the cabin in the early morning, with the frost still on the grass and their breath visible in the air, Lydia stumbled on the uneven ground near the gate. Nothing serious, just a misstep in the half-dark. And Gideon caught her arm, and then neither of them moved for a moment. She looked at him. He was still holding her arm. He became aware of this with a specific clarity. "Thank you," she said, meaning the catch, and possibly meaning other things. "Careful on this part," he said. "The ground's still uneven. I keep meaning to level it." "I know," she said. "I've been meaning to tell you to level it for 6 months." He let go of her arm and they walked back to the cabin, and the morning came on around them in the way Montana mornings did. Huge and quiet and indifferent to everything but itself, which was, in its way, a relief. It was June when the thing happened with Calvin Rhodes. Gideon had not sought it. He'd spent the winter deciding he wasn't going to seek it, that the man existed in a separate category from the life he was building, that justice was Callahan's domain and not his, and that the version of events where Gideon Mercer went looking for a reckoning was a version that ended badly for everyone, including Lydia. But Willow Ridge was a small town, and small towns had a way of arranging collisions regardless of anyone's preference. He was at the lumberyard on a Tuesday morning when Calvin Rhodes came in to order fencing materials. They saw each other at the same time, across a yard full of cut timber and the particular sharp smell of fresh sawdust. Rhodes looked like a man who had been waiting for this collision and had prepared for it poorly. He was thicker in the face than Gideon remembered from winter, softer in some way that had less to do with the season and more to do with the specific softness that comes from months of avoiding a consequence. "Mercer," he said. Gideon looked at him. He'd had a speech prepared once, back in October, when his anger had been a specific shape that wanted an outlet. He'd constructed it carefully over a week of evenings, built it out of everything the man had done and everything it had cost. The Singer sewing machine and the winter coat and the 40 miles of mud and the 3 days at the depot and every whisper in every store and Lydia sitting on the porch in the rain deciding whether to disappear again. He looked at Calvin Rhodes in the lumberyard, and all of it was still true. Not one word of it had changed, and he also thought about Lydia at the table the morning after they'd cleared her name, talking about the sewing machine. He thought about her writing to Mrs. Aldrich. He thought about her crouching in the early light to look at 12 marigold shoots coming back through hard soil. He thought about the fact that she wasn't carrying it anymore. And he didn't want to be the person who picked it back up and handed it to her by making this into something she'd have to hear about and manage and accommodate. "Rhodes," he said. And then he picked up his lumber order and he left. He drove home. He put the lumber away. He didn't tell Lydia about the encounter for 3 days. And when he did tell her, it was because she'd asked directly why he'd been quieter than usual, and he wasn't going to lie to her. She listened to the whole thing. Then she was quiet. "You didn't say anything to him," she said. Not a question. "I said his name." "That's all?" "That's all." She looked at her hands. "Was that hard?" "Yes," he said. "Why did you do it that way?" He thought about the honest answer. "Because anything I said to him was going to come back to you in some form," he said. "And because the person he hurt is already past him. I didn't want to drag her back." She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in her face, complicated and layered, the kind of thing that would have taken several paragraphs to describe and was better understood as the specific expression of a person receiving something they didn't know they needed until it arrived. "He's going to go on," she said, "living exactly the way he lives. Nothing will change for him." "Probably," Gideon said. "I don't have a good answer for that." "I'm not asking for one," she said. "I'm just saying it out loud so it doesn't sit so heavy. That's what the table is for." She repeated his own words back to him with a quietness that wasn't mockery and wasn't quite humor, but lived somewhere between them. He recognized them. "Yes," he said. She nodded, turned back to the commission she'd been working on. A summer dress for Bertie Schultz's niece, who was getting married in August, yellow fabric with a small white pattern, the most technically complex thing she'd taken on yet. Her hands moved through the work with the clean confidence of someone who has been doing a thing long enough that the knowledge lives in the body rather than the mind. He watched her work for a while. "Lydia," he said. She looked up. He'd been thinking about how to say it for 3 months. He'd arranged and rearranged it the way she arranged seams, looking for the version that held, that wouldn't come apart at the wrong moment. He'd decided several times that the practical arrangement they had was enough and didn't need to be named. He'd decided several times that the thing underneath the practical arrangement deserved to be named and was only made smaller by leaving it unnamed. "I'd like to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know that whatever you answer, the loan stands and the table stands, and Mary is yours to name regardless." She set down the fabric. "All right," she said. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Not the way you've been staying. I mean—" He stopped, started over. "I mean that I want to marry you, if you're willing. Not as an arrangement, not because it's practical, though it is practical, but I want you to stay because I want you to stay. That's the whole of it." The room was very quiet. She looked at him. He held her gaze. "I'm not easy," she said finally. "I'm aware of that. I have opinions about seams, and I get up before anyone else, and I rearrange things, and I don't talk enough about what I'm feeling until all at once I do." "I know," he said. "And you've been alone a long time," she said. "Long enough that you're used to things a certain way." "I was used to things a certain way," he said. "I'm less used to it now." She looked at the table, at the singer on the good end, at the yellow wedding fabric, at the window with the light coming through it the way Montana light came through things in June. Sideways and very clear, the kind of light that showed everything exactly as it was. "I came here to marry someone," she said quietly. "I burned those letters because the person who wrote them wasn't real." She looked up at him. "You're real, Gideon. That's not a small thing. I've spent enough time around what the alternative looks like to know what real costs and what it's worth." "Is that a yes?" he said. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without performance. She almost smiled. The full version this time. He was still learning it. "That's a yes," she said. He exhaled. He hadn't known until that moment how much he'd been holding. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They looked at each other for a moment. Neither of them moved dramatically. Neither of them said anything that would have sounded well in a different kind of story. He stayed in his chair. She picked up the yellow fabric again. "I'll need to take the dress in on the left side," she said. "Bertie's niece is smaller through the shoulder than the measurement suggested." "Is that fixable?" he said. "Everything's fixable," she said, "if you catch it early enough." He looked at his hands, rough hands, cracked at the same knuckles that never quite healed over. The hands of a man who'd spent 22 years on a piece of land that required everything he had. He thought about the night he'd carried Lydia home in the rain, 4 miles in the dark, with his hand on her back, making sure she didn't slide. He thought about the morning she'd burned 9 months of lies in his fireplace and asked where to find a bucket. He thought about every small thing between then and now. The chinking, the marigolds, the cornbread, the creek road in October, the porch in the rain, Emmett Stokes in the snow, the sewing machine and the loan terms, and the filly who was called Mary and had opinions about everything. He thought about Margaret and Clara, whose names lived in a Bible on the shelf, and in the part of him that had made the long journey from Illinois with nothing to show for the grief except the land and the years. He thought that loving someone new didn't require forgetting the people you'd loved before. He thought that a life could hold more than one chapter without the later ones canceling the earlier ones out. He thought these things and didn't say most of them, because that was how he was. And Lydia knew it, and she'd decided to stay anyway, and that was its own kind of answer to a question he hadn't known how to ask. The wedding was small, which was the only way either of them wanted it. Bertie Schultz came. Callahan came, which surprised Gideon and didn't seem to surprise Lydia at all. Dell came and stood at the edge of things, with the expression of a young man deeply invested in appearing unmoved. Tuck Bigelow and his wife came. Ida Brace from the alteration shop came and shook Lydia's hand in the direct way of one practical woman greeting another. Dora Marsh sent flowers. She didn't come herself, but she sent a good arrangement that arrived the morning of, which Lydia accepted without comment and put on the table next to the singer. The Harmon family sent a note. Lydia wrote back a short reply, which she didn't read to Gideon, and that was the end of that. Calvin Rhodes sent nothing. He was not expected to. It was a Tuesday in July because there was no particularly good reason for it to be a Saturday, and Tuesdays were when the circuit judge came through and the paperwork could be filed correctly. Lydia wore the blue wool coat that had been Bertie's mother's. Too warm for July, but it was what she had that was closest to formal, and she wore it open over the dress she'd made herself in the weeks before. A dark green that suited the Montana summer in a way she couldn't have planned for when she chose the color in Ohio. She didn't carry anything. She'd thought about it, Gideon knew, because she'd mentioned the small travel case once, the one she'd arrived with, the one that had burst open in the mud and been stuffed back together in the rain. She'd thought about whether there was something in it worth keeping for a moment like this. She'd told him, the week before, that she'd been through the case and found 3 things she wanted to keep. The handkerchief he'd given her that first sick week when she'd needed one, and he'd had one to give, slightly mended at one corner where it had frayed. A dried flower from the marigold row, one of the October ones, before the frost, pressed flat in the back of her letter paper. And the letter from Emmett Stokes, written in someone else's hand with his own words, on the snowy Saturday when an old man had walked a mile to say he'd been wrong. She'd put the case itself in the back of the barn, not thrown away, just set aside in the category of things that didn't need to be carried anymore. He hadn't given her a ring yet, which was something he was addressing through a correspondence with a metal worker in Billings, and it would arrive when it arrived. She'd said she didn't mind, that she'd spent too long measuring things by their packaging. After, when the small group had moved from the judge's office to Bertie's kitchen for the meal, Bertie had insisted on organizing. Gideon found himself standing briefly alone in the doorway between rooms, watching Lydia talk with Callahan's wife, who had come along and turned out to have strong opinions about fabric that Lydia was engaging with fully and equally. He watched her hands move when she talked, the way they always did when she was describing something she cared about. And he watched the particular quality of her attention when someone else was speaking, the way she listened with her whole face. He thought, I know her, not completely, not the way you thought you knew someone at the beginning of knowing them, that false completeness of early impression. The real version, the version that knew her stories weren't all said yet, that there were moods he hadn't seen and opinions he hadn't heard, and probably a fairly impressive capacity for anger under the right conditions that she'd only barely shown him once or twice. He knew her the way you know someone you've watched manage hard things with limited resources, and that kind of knowing was the only kind that meant anything. Bertie appeared at his elbow with a plate. You look like a man having a large thought, she said. Small one, he said. What was it? He considered. That I did the right thing, he said, the night I found her in the road. Bertie looked at him with the expression of someone who was deciding how much sentiment to tolerate before saying something practical. She chose the practical, which was exactly what he expected from her. You stopped, she said. That's all you did. The rest of it she did herself. He took the plate. I know, he said. That's the part I was thinking about. Bertie nodded, satisfied, and went back to her kitchen. He watched Lydia across the room. His wife, that was the fact of it now, a word that fit differently than he'd expected, more quietly than he'd thought. And she looked up at that moment and met his eyes across Bertie Schultz's kitchen through the noise and the warmth and the ordinary, complicated human texture of a small celebration. She didn't smile, or not exactly. She just looked at him with the clear-eyed recognition of a person who sees where they are and has decided it's where they want to be. He looked back. That was all. That was enough. The marigolds came back the following spring as well, and the one after that. 12 the second year, more the third, until the row had spread wide enough that Lydia cleared a proper bed for them along the full length of the porch, which had been repaired and reinforced over the winter until it didn't lean anymore. They weren't a remarkable flower. Anyone who knew anything about gardens would tell you that. Common, hardy, undemanding, the kind of plant that doesn't require much and doesn't produce anything especially rare. They came from a handful of seeds that had been living in the lining of a ruined travel bag, seeds that arrived without intention in a place they weren't planted. They came back every year anyway. Some things were like that. You couldn't plan them, couldn't force them, could barely even claim credit for them. You could only not destroy them when they showed up, and make enough room and let them be what they were. Lydia Rowan had come 40 miles through the rain to a place that wasn't expecting her, to a life that was supposed to have been someone else's entirely, and she had built something out of the actual materials available to her rather than the imagined ones. A sewing machine and a loan repaid in full by the following October. A reputation earned by the particular stubbornness of doing good work and accounting for her time and refusing, ultimately, to be made smaller than she was. A row of marigolds she'd grown from seeds she hadn't even known she was carrying. Gideon Mercer had spent 11 years on a piece of land and built a life that was functional and solitary, and had a north wall that leaked cold air and a porch that leaned. He'd survived everything that had come at him by putting his head down and pushing through it, which was a useful quality, and also sometimes a way of being alone that wore the clothes of self-sufficiency so well it could fool you for years. What neither of them had been able to do alone was simple. Stop. Look up. Let something in. It was not a lesson either of them would have chosen to learn the way they learned it. Given the option, Lydia would have preferred a man who actually owned a ranch with flowers in the yard and a porch that faced the mountains, and who showed up at the depot. Gideon would have preferred a version of the past that hadn't required 11 years of managed quiet to move through. But you didn't get to pick the road. You only got to pick what you did when the road stopped you, when the thing in the way turned out to be the thing you needed, when the loss that was supposed to end everything turned out to be the door to something the loss had made room for. That wasn't a comfort you could offer in advance. It didn't work that way. It only made sense from the other side, looking back at the mud and the dark and the fire that burned 9 months of lies in 45 seconds, and all the small impossible moments between that night and this one. Some roads led exactly where they were always meant to end. Not because they were meant to, but because two people, separately and then together, had refused to stop walking. This is a work of fiction created entirely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, and events are imaginary.